Welcome to our second rendition of the Awaken Church podcast. I think we're calling it Awaken the Day.
Awaken the Day.
Awaken the Day right now. We're so excited to open up with two of our staffers here. Would you like to just, talk about yourself for a little bit, introduce yourself? And we're going to be talking about biblical masculinity from our last sermon. So some of our responses, some of our thoughts about that. So I will let Josiah take it away and just give a quick preface about who he is and, this topic.
Yeah, so I am Josiah Liu. I am a man, and I love the Bible and all that is in it. So I figured that I would be a solid choice for this particular podcast. But I think that there's been a lot of misconceptions about masculinity in the world today. I think there's a lot of confusion with young people and a lot of broken boys who look to people like, Andrew Tate or whoever else to give them what manhood is. There's a lot of counterfeit. I have seen and grew up in a church with my dad as a pastor and surrounded by men who commit to seeking out the Lord and seeking out manhood, or seeking out first what it means to be a godly child and a godly man. And I think that order matters. So,
yeah, my name's Chrissian. Christian Potter for the IRS. I'm on staff here at Awaken, and I think that, in short, I think we should be looking to Scripture and ultimately, obviously, to God to, we should be looking to our Creator, to the one that He has defined what manhood is, what it looks like, and, it's not just, the path to salvation is a narrow road, but biblical manhood is not.
Yeah, awesome. Love those thoughts. I'm Nick, our moderator for this conversation. And yeah, we live in a time now, maybe more than ever, which is something people say in every generation.
it's always true, I think.
Young men are lost, looking for purpose, looking for direction in this season because of so much information overload. And it feels like the Bible gives pretty clear direction and purpose to these people. And young men, old men, just anybody who's just kind of looking for, hey, where am I supposed to be and what am I supposed to be doing seems to be common problems of this age. So we're going to dive into that. I'm super excited for this conversation. Listening back to the sermon, Frank's, in his intro, he opens up with this idea that our design points to our purpose. And I love that. I enjoy that. I think that's a biblical picture, but I feel like I can hear some young Christians maybe pushing back a little bit, young and confused, just saying, hey, what if I'm just not good at my purpose? Like, I don't feel like I was well designed for what you're telling me I'm called to. I'm not like buff. I'm not this take charge, great communicator with a projecting voice. I don't feel like God has given me the traits to succeed here. I don't feel like I'm good at this purpose I was supposedly designed for.
Yeah. I think that kind of goes back to what, I was saying a minute or two ago, is that we have put this idea of biblical manhood, biblical masculinity. We've kind of painted one picture for it, and it's a very, God has designed, when we think of the church body, men can be in each part of that church body. Men can be gifted very differently. And I think I'll speak to church leaders and anyone that identifies themselves as a leader. Your job, your primary job as a leader is always going to be to help someone discover their gifting and enable them to be in that gifting, enable them to flourish in that gifting, right? I think it was Jerry that was kind of talking about within the context of his own household, it's a garden. He has to tend to it and work to it the same way that Adam was. Yeah. And I think that leadership is in the same way. Those young men, I encourage you to keep asking those questions. I encourage you to feel that way, to express that to leaders. And leaders, I implore you to, help them discover what it looks like. Hey, what activates you? Ask them really good questions. And hey, what burdens you? I think Frank, a number of years ago, gave a sermon at our Faith Walkers conference. It was what burdens you? What when it's done wrong, burdens you the absolute most? And for every single man, it is not going to be the same. I can say, for me and Josiah, we lead Awakening together. Everyone at Awaken knows, I'm not musically inclined at all, right? I'm just not. I wish I was. I'm just not. The things that are gonna burden him in worship and like the aspect of like what musical worship looks like can be very different to me. You know, I'm just like, hey, like, let's worship. And Josiah's like, hey, like, these things could be done differently. It's a different skill set.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would say young men that are asking that question, that are wrestling with that, you're in a really good place. I want to challenge you and just like affirm you and encourage you, like, hey, if that's the question you're asking, it's a good question to be asking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you're asking the question, you're already on the right track because you're wondering. It's the same answer I would give somebody who says, I don't know if, or maybe it's like I'm scared that I'm doubting either, you know, maybe my salvation or the existence of God. And I'm like, well, first of all, the fact that you're scared about that means in all likelihood that you are saved and solid and that you know who God is because you care enough to be scared. And so, you know, maybe not always helpful to hear, but it is the truth because if you're worried about am I a biblical man or am I on the right track for biblical manhood, you're on the right track for thinking about it and worrying about it. I would also say that if you're considering and wondering if how can I be a biblical man when I feel like I'm not designed for it or not built for it, God designed us intentionally. And if we feel like that we are not designed to fit the parameters that God has set for us, then we're not thinking right. Biblical manhood is something that God has set for us as a standard, and He has designed us intentionally. Those two factors do not result in, I don't fit that. It's the question should rather be, so how do I fit that? Right? I'm an emotional guy. I'm not a natural leader. I'm loud, but I'd rather use it to laugh loudly and not command loudly. I'm not really the take charge type in any sense. I'm pretty more of the laid back type. I've learned to mitigate that in some different ways, but what's important to know is that you have weaknesses. Some of it's more obvious than others, right? If my weakness, like if you're, I don't know, like something simple, like if you're not outspoken and if you're not used to speaking in public or whatever, you can count that as a weakness. That's fine. But if you want to lead in a certain way, how are you going to overcome said weakness? I think one of the best, most practical ways to explore what biblical manhood looks like with how God has made you is what things do you need to overcome? What weaknesses, weakness is a bad word for it. What challenges do you need to overcome? Like, a big one for all men is passivity, right? Passivity is, arguably, what allowed Eve to bite the apple, right? Adam was there with her in the garden, maybe not right next to her, but still in the same vicinity. And so, what steps are you taking in order to be not a passive man, and what does that look like in your life? And so, I feel like that's at least an important, easily identifiable step for everybody.
Yeah, and I think that's why asking the question is important because that's the first step of initiative is figuring out what to do.
Yeah, I love these perspectives, right? There's a passion here present in this question and the young men who are asking it, but right, maybe we take that passion and we shift the framework, right? Mm-hmm. It is not an I, there are very rigid pieces and gaps that I have to mold myself to fit in, and it's more of like God has made you as this intricately complex puzzle piece, and you need to figure out where He wants you to fit because there is a place, right? Mm-hmm. We presume that because God is a good God, He's designed us with the gifts and the talents and the personalities that we have, that God has a place for us in the kingdom, instead of saying, hey, I'm so awkward in this way, or I feel like I don't relate with other guys this way, or have some of these features, that I must not belong here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I love that it's, hey, don't box yourself out, but broaden your horizons to expand your definitions of, hey, how am I leading? How am I exploring biblical manhood in this ways and taking initiative and not being passive? So I really appreciate those thoughts. I'd love to jump to, Julio made a comment kind of talking about an archetype of his day, this maybe bifurcation of the term between the sissified man and the super macho man, right? The Harry Styles wearing a dress versus the liver king, super testosterone. Yeah. He said it's neither. We would cross out both examples. Neither are biblical manhood. I'd love to ask, so where are our examples of biblical manhood? Who is it? Just this person has a lot of good traits that we can look up to and follow for that kind of model.
Yeah. That's a good question, because there's a lot of examples of men in the Bible who almost on the surface level fit those two, liver king and quote unquote sissified man, right? Like you have, Samson and David, right? And you have David the artist, and also maybe Solomon could be a good example, or maybe Gideon, maybe. Bad example is off the top of my head, but either way, I think the point that I'm getting to here is that the world puts sissified man or macho man because they're pulling out truths and twisting them to what they think they should be, because the sissified man is good because they're sensitive, they listen well, they're emotionally available or emotionally in tune, all these other things, but then they put hairstyles in a dress, right? Versus the liver king type macho man, right, is strong, capable, a good leader, director, determined, good protector, and all these other things, right? But also, at its worst, abusive, emotionally closed off, like all these other things, because you have to be strong and look strong, and that's why there are these two camps, is because they both have these twisted truths in them. And so taking a step back and saying, okay, what are the examples in the Bible that we have? I feel like David is a really good example of a man in all those aspects. I think second to Jesus, David is probably the man's man in all aspects of things, because he was first and foremost, because you're probably thinking, oh yeah, he was like an emotional guy and he was a warrior. It's like, no, man, he was a man after God's own heart first. And that, I think, is the core of biblical manhood, is, are you a man after God's own will? And maybe you're not going to be like David, maybe you're not going to be like all that, but I think that is the core of the question, and I think David models what that looks like, even if imperfectly.
Yeah, I love those thoughts. I think David's a good example, right? Specifically because he is a man after God's own heart, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes I feel like, we want a Christian icon for this strength training regimen that I'm doing. So I'm going to call it the Samson regimen, because that's what manhood's all about. Mm-hmm. Like, come on, muscles and strong. Mm-hmm. And I feel like when we look at Samson, we look at like power, like platform wasted. Mm-hmm. Like I would say so I would even say he's like an awful definition of biblical manhood, because, right, he might have a lot of physical strength, but he neglects his responsibilities. He only thinks selfishly, and he uses the power and platform he has to pursue his passions and only the things that he wants, which is an innate rejection of all of what we believe biblical manhood to be. Right, he's rejecting responsibility, provision, all these things, and he's saying, I know what I want, and I'm going to take it. And that, I would say, falls pretty clearly outside of our definition of biblical manhood.
Cheers.
Yeah, I'd take it a step further, and I would just, again, I'm going to focus this conversation towards like the young man that's new in his faith, or the older man that's probably like struggling in like the early stages of marriage, or maybe you're even 30 and you're still single, whatever it may be. I think it's very imperative when you're thinking of this idea of men to look up to, and I would just be very, very direct in saying that, like, it has to be men with an E, not man with an A. In a physical sense, right? Like, obviously, we're gonna look up to Jesus, right? Like, we're gonna look up to God, obviously. I think like the important thing is that we're not God. We're never gonna be God. But like, I think of the men in my life right now. I'm thinking Andrew, Charles, your dad Frank, JB, Jerry, Julio. Like, men in my life that, from conversation, from just being around them in relationship, like, I've seen them serve their families, I've seen them serve their wives, I've seen them serve their church, I've seen them just in humility, like, and these are men that, deacons / pastors, like, from where I was growing up, like, you don't think like, oh, they don't need to be humble, like, they're one of the leaders in the church, like, they should be asserting themselves, they should be authoritative all the time. It's no, like, in humility, the way that they have conversations, the way they deal with confrontation, the way that they handle, like, someone coming to them complaining about something. Like, I've seen that firsthand, and so I would just say, like, be surrounding yourself with men that very much so are already on the camp of, like, I will always, like, surrender to Christ, and if I'm not, I expect the men around me to remind me that I'm not surrendering my life to Christ right now, and I need to continuously do that.
Yeah. I appreciate that thought process here, right? It's like less of like, hey, there's this idealistic man from culture or a celebrity or from a particular story. That's what I'm cut out to be, is like, or that I'm striving after. And it's like, there is plenty of men in our own communities who are doing these things, who are trying their hardest to lead and walk humbly and justly. And it's maybe more important for us other than Jesus, right? To strive after being and in discipleship, being led, being held accountable by them because they have gone through some of the fires of what it means to be.
Yeah, and I would just, to top that off, I would just say like it's more important to do that with men that are in your community because you're seeing their lives.
Yeah.
You know, you don't see men that are on YouTube, TikTok, whatever it may be. And this is like my biggest thing against like Christian TikTok is like we don't see what they're doing once the camera's off, right? Like we don't see what certain celebrity pastors are doing once they're out of the pulpit. And that's not like a knock on them. It's more so of like a reflection on yourself. Like, are you idolizing a man that like you're only seeing them in the best times or when they're preaching the word? Like, you know, and again, I'm talking about men that like, you know, I can say like Andrew and Frank are two of my pastors. Richard, my pastors have profoundly shaped my life by the way that I've seen them live their lives more so than they have in the pulpit. And that's how it's supposed to be.
Amen. Yeah. That's great perspective. I appreciate you sharing, right? It's not this, like, because the men in our own lives, they don't get to cut and edit and clip out
100%.
the times where they're
100%.
not true with their wives,
Exactly.
or they're not
Yep.
being gentle with their children, or they're just being passive at home. We exist and live out in all those moments in our biblical communities, and we just say, hey, Chrissian, like, man, I've just been struggling to lead my wife and our family financially. I feel like I've been really lacking in that area, and that transparency and humility reflects our desire to grow in our heart for the Lord. Love that. We covered three or four main responsibilities of manhood in this message, right? I think Jerry and JP kind of hit on this a little bit. It was love, leadership, responsibility, and provision. So keeping those in mind, love, responsibility, leadership, and provision. Which of these do we think Christian men often overlook? Which falls into between cracks? It just falls off our radar the most.
Say it one more time.
Yeah. Love, leadership, responsibility, provision.
Let's say responsibility and provision are kind of like the same part.
Sure.
Okay. Overlook's a strong word. I would say maybe prioritize the least of those. And I'm gonna speak off of men that, you know, I see in my life, young men, older men. I would say leadership. And the reason being is that a lot of times we, you know, like some men believe the lie of like, oh, well, I'm not the best communicator, I'm not leading. I don't have the gift of teaching, so I can't lead. You know, I'm not, you know, I don't have the best ideas in my house. So like we heard JB say like, man, like I had to deal with, you know, my ego of my wife coming up with a lot of great ideas, creative ideas. And he had to like challenge his ego. And like, again, leadership there wasn't to be responsible for coming up with ideas, but as the man of the household, how does he create an environment that his wife feels so loved and cherished and encouraged that she continues to come up with creative ideas to flourish their family, to love their family, to raise their family. I think like that is the aspect of leading that gets overlooked, right? Or deprioritized is the word that I was using. Is just like, you know, this idea of like, oh, well, as a man, I have to lead the household. That means what I say goes, and you know, it's 100% not the case. Like if you're leading and you're not, you know, taking feedback from people in your life, like if you're a single man and you're not like looking at your friends and like getting their feedback or asking for their feedback, like I think one of the biggest things to ask people that you're around, like just as any Christian in general, this woman and man, is like, hey, like what's an area that you think I can grow in spiritually? Or like what's an area that you feel unloved in? Or what's an area that like you think I can improve in? Is just like, you know, asking someone that is really big. But yeah, I think even the other day I was talking to my wife and she was saying like, hey, like you responded this way when I said this and it made me feel like I can't come to you for stuff. And I'm just like, oh man, like I didn't even consider like, you know, like that wasn't even a thought in my head. But you know, leadership is not, you know, getting defensive and saying, oh, you know, like I didn't mean it that way. It's like, no, it's like, hey, like I'm terribly sorry. My intention was 100% not to do that, but I'm going to make it a point of emphasis that when I speak to you, like I'm being incredibly more considerate. Because like, again, that idea that Jerry shared of tending the garden is not like screaming at the plant, like not calling my wife a plant, but the idea rather. Not, but it's like tending to it and be like, oh man, like I could do this differently. Like, oh man, maybe it needs more water, or oh man, like maybe a different soil would be better, or a different fertilizer, or something like that. It's like, man, me taking, you know, an extra minute to consider my response might bear way more fruit than me just like keep coming up with something.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I appreciate being vulnerable and sharing those examples. Definitely feel that in some of it, right? I have a relationship, and I think a way that we can often lack from these 4 principles is, I guess it falls under leadership or provision. I feel like a lot of times with husbands, there's this focus and emphasis on very physical, practical provision, stoicism, like, hey, I'm going to lead these ways, I'm going to make decisions, I'm going to do all these things. And there's just maybe a failure of spiritual leadership. It's like, yeah, you know, you might do all the practical things for your family. You might be setting up your 401k and like just all of these physical things, fixing the house, doing all of these things. But right, if you're not taking the time to lead your wife in prayer, to come before God on your own and make sure your heart is right with Him and you're growing, take the time to make sure you're growing in your walk with God and the Word, instead of just focusing on practically how can I serve and ensure the survival and thrival of the people around me, you almost lose a little bit of it, because it's just like, man, I've been so focused on trying to make my finances work, I haven't even prayed about this. I haven't even asked God, God, I ask that your hand be over my family, and you bless us, and I trust that you will take care of us. So much so that, right, we kind of end up in this family dynamic where a lot of American churches are, where it's like, yeah, women are the ones who are more often coming to church. Women make up the majority of that population. It's without their husbands because they're too busy working, because they think their job, their money, everything is too important except for a relationship with God.
Yeah, I feel like I would argue leadership encompasses the 4 anyway: love, leadership, responsibility, and provision. Because if you're leading well, you're loving well. If you're leading well, you are taking responsibility of things you should. And if you're leading well, then you're providing as necessary. And so I think one of my biggest struggles was the concept of leadership, because in my mind, I was not competent to be a leader. I still struggle with that because, you know, I am no perfect man. But the idea of leadership is intimidating, because that means responsibility, that means possibility of failure, and that means, I mean, for a long time, I wasn't even, I was like, honestly, I'm okay with never being in a relationship, because then I wouldn't have to fail in leadership, and I would not have to, you know, fail in, you know, not loving, providing, caring for my wife in such a way. That's obviously changed for the better, because I am engaged now, which is super cool. But that also means that that I have to accept as a man the role of a leader, which means to love well, to take responsibilities of provision or whatever else there's there. And I think, honestly, leadership is humility and servitude before anything else, and submission, honestly, to Christ. Because as we submit to Christ, we are submitting to His way of doing things, which is the right way and the healthy way. And I think one of the biggest telltales of the fading of biblical manhood, if you want to be dramatic about it, is women showing up to church a lot more than men statistically, because men assuming that they should be the ones to lead or whatever. So like, I don't need this. I should be able to go on my own. Yeah. And on the surface, that sounds kind of crazy, but I've been like in that for the past few months. Like me personally, the past few months of just, I need to be like get my stuff together in order to be a good husband. Eventually, I need to make sure I got my job and stuff. So I'm working as hard as I can, and I have let my own quiet times even slip, because I guess in my head I'm like, I need to be the one to provide and stuff, while struggling to remember to submit to God, to say that He is the one who provides and He is the one who will direct, and I just need to follow Him. And I think that letting go of that control is scary, especially when your and your loved ones' lives, livelihoods depend on that. But I think even just as single guys, for instance, who are you submitting to? Are you submitting to your desires? Or are you submitting to how God is to live your life?
It's a big one.
Yeah. Definitely resonate with a lot of those concepts, right? Especially this kind of frustration is like, my time is better spent strategizing for my family and working as hard as I possibly can, rather than relinquishing control of this and trusting God. Yeah. Definitely. I love those ideas. I'd love to know, what is it, so we talked about these responsibilities like love, leadership, responsibility, provision, and how they come out in Ephesians 5 and Genesis. in biblical manhood. What does it look like for us to have these responsibilities as single men in the church?
Yeah. So I think a lot of single guys are either concerned about getting married or being a bachelor till the rapture, which may seem like the only two options you have as a male.
It's a bar, bro.
Which honestly, yeah, I guess on the surface of it, but really, if those are your two either ors, then you're missing the whole point of living life in general, which is to love God first and love each other second. And I think as a single guys, if you cannot get the idea of marriage out of your head, fair. But that just means that you have to die to yourself daily to put God in front first. And if you are a single guy and you're terrified of the idea of marriage and you don't want to get married, fine. But you have to put the love of God and love of others in front of your fears anyway.
Yeah.
And so I think with single guys, I think a lot of time is wasted on worry, and a lot of time is wasted on fear. I think I say wasted on fear and worry, because worry's not saying that you're wasting your time if you worry or fear at all, but rather if you are feeding into worry and fear, or if you are not bringing those to God. Because ultimately, courage is not marked by a lack of fear. It is a mark of, are you overcoming that fear, right? Because when God says, do not fear, for I am with you, right? He's not saying do not feel fear, but he's saying, hey, take that fear and give it to me because I'm with you, right? And so for single guys, I think this idea of manhood doesn't necessarily mean independence, but rather a dependence on God. And how is that reflecting in your life? Are you, like, whenever you talk to people and they say, how's your life going? Is it about me, or is it about what God is doing in my life? And I think that's a fair marker of where your focus is on.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. Julio kind of touched on reevaluating, all my sentences are revolving around me or I.
Yes.
And maybe you do have to step back and evaluate whether that's a single person or a married person or a father with kids, right? There is this, despite the fact that you might not be one flesh with somebody else or have a family to take care of, there's still this there's still an other that you can be focusing on, that you can be leading, that you can be loving and providing for in your community.
Yeah, and I think it was either this past Sunday or some other one, but I love the challenges that our pastors and other guys have been giving, which is, you guys are worried about and thinking about marriage. You haven't even cleaned your room yet, or you haven't even you can't even wake up on time for work, or and there's things in your life that you're like, I want this, and you're completely neglecting your responsibilities or the ways that you need to things that you need to address in your own life, not just for marriage but for your walk with God. And so I think, are you talking about I, or are you listening to God? So
Yeah, I'd piggyback off that and ask questions, and that self-eval. We tell guys self-evaluate. I'd say, okay, what ministry are you committed to being a part of? Who's discipling you? I'd say, what does your sphere at work look like? What's your sphere at school look like? What does your family life look like? Obviously outside of being married, for a single man, what does your relationship with your parents look like? Your siblings look like? Your cousins, your aunts, uncles, all that. I just continuously ask those questions, and I'd come down to, what do they walk away from? How do they walk away after a conversation with you? Do they feel encouraged? Do they feel refreshed? Do they feel like they've been pointed to Jesus? Do they know the gospel? And again, this isn't to say, hey, communicate the gospel every single time, but people should know there's something different about you, that you've been transformed by Christ in some way, shape, or form when they walk away.
And sometimes I think that does mean sharing the gospel.
Yeah, that absolutely, yes. Yeah. Don't let it be a side note of, I'm not going to share the gospel, but yes, I would just run that through the self-eval.
Yeah, those self-eval ideas, man, it kind of brought this great thought to my mind, right? When you get married, your sphere of the people who you can lead and love and influence only increases by one person.
True.
Right? That is the difference that's being made here. Because one person is being added. It's not okay, now that I'm married, I can be a leader in my community. I can take initiative. I can I can be a home group leader and I can be a church leader and all these different formats.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
only a change of one.
Yeah.
No, I really appreciate that. Actually, that's something I forget to think about. But there is this weird dividing line between single guys and married guys in the realm of leadership. And I think that's like some people think, okay, now that I'm married, I have the spiritual maturity to lead a home group or do all these other things and disciple people and all that stuff. And I think that does a huge disservice to people who are single because God does not say, Paul doesn't tell people to,
Get married and become a pastor.
Get married and become a pastor. Paul even says like be single so that you can be focused on ministry, which automatically entails what he tells Timothy about leadership and about serving the church and being a part of the body of Christ and stuff, right? And I think that if you're waiting to get married to be a leader, then you have
You're not making the most of your time.
Yeah, you're not making the most of your time. It's wrong order.
Because God doesn't guarantee us marriage. Like, so what are you doing in the meantime? You're just like, oh, I'm just gonna sit here. Passivity.
Yeah. If you're waiting to get married to lead, that's passive, because you're not sowing seeds for being a good leader within your marriage. Your marriage should be a continuation of your leadership, not a beginning of it.
Yeah, and again, just to be clear, like leadership is not. There's my wife says all the time, there's more than one way to skin a cat. Like leadership is not, I talk really well, people look up to me. A lot of times, I'll shout out to my main man, Hayden. Like Hayden's form of leadership was leading by example, and the fact that like he was serving week in and week out at Awakening, like without, like Hayden never complained, never groaned, like he served cheerfully, and like that was a form of leadership because people started serving alongside of him. And Hayden does not talk that much at all.
I appreciate all those thoughts. I'd love to follow up with one last question. How do we as a church work to glorify like the everyday, simple, sacrificial man that JB was talking about? Like the simple, sacrificial like moments as a husband where you're just having a quiet conversation, you're trying to be intentional about communication with your wife or whatever it looks like in your season, over like this glorious death of like, I will physically lay my life down to save you. Don't worry, I'm like the strong man that's here. Right. How do we kind of shift our perspectives?
I think one of the best pieces of advice I've heard, again, it's in the realm of marriage, but if single guys are thinking about getting married and they can't get that out of their heads, then a helpful tool to help you, run towards biblical manhood is the way that you treat your wife is the way that you'll treat the way that you treat your roommates, mom, sister in your house is the way that you'll treat your wife. So if your wife sees how you, or if friends or potential wife or girlfriend or whatever sees how you interact with your roommates and mom and sisters and kind of raises an eyebrow or like is weird, there's a problem, right? And so I think those small times where, if my mom or sister does something to annoy me, am I, A, going to yell, B, say nothing, or C, communicate that this frustrated me in a way that is healthy and that will better our relationship in the future. And so those small little death moments, right, are practiced in your immediate circle of the people you live with and you live your life with. I think that's probably the best practical way to measure or be aware of those things. Even just the little things like initiating doing dishes. Like I really appreciate one of the guys mentioned that the two I's, right? Initiative and influence, right? Yeah. I think initiative being a big one for me personally that I struggle with is I could either wait for my parents to ask me to do the dishes or clean up, or I can just say, or I can just initiate and do them without being asked, right? And I think there is the reactionary there's the reactionary obedience, and then there's the proactive obedience. And I think that's the difference between passivity and initiative.
Yeah, I would say I think the biggest way that the church does this, like in a cultural sense and an intentional sense, is accountability. Yeah. I think as men we need to stop making the assumption that my brother's okay because I see him right now. We need to stop making that assumption. Yeah. And we need to ask. I have men in my life that men that we've been in. The beauty of being in a church community as long as I've been at Awaken, like since I was 19, is that I have men that we were single together, I've seen them date, get married. Now I'm seeing some of them have kids. Like they ask me like, hey, how have you loved your wife recently? Like, hey, like what does a small thing look like? Like asking those questions rather than assuming. Like I have men that are able to, it's encouraged for them to ask me those questions. It's encouraged that, if they see me speak to my wife a certain way that they don't feel like is honoring or glorifying, I expect them to call me out on it. And that's why I say like accountability is the best way. Is like, we can't just preach about it. We got to be holding each other accountable to it. Like as men, we have to hold each other to this accountable standard of like, hey, how are you loving your roommate? Like, hey, how are you doing that? It's like, dude, it's, things can be tough, and accountability isn't just like, hey, did you check the box off? Accountability is, when your brother tells you it's tough, how are you coming alongside, putting your arm around him and be like, hey, we're gonna do this together, like sometimes, and I would say like in a marriage sense, it's like, obviously I'm not gonna ask another man to love my wife, or, like that's not what I'm saying, but it's more so like, he's gonna hold me even more accountable. He's gonna give me some ideas. He's gonna be like, hey dude, like you should totally like just buy your wife some flowers and, like give her the night off from any chores in the house, like just knock everything out. And if you're like, dude, I just worked like the 12-hour shift, blah, 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 I do like, make it an absolute priority to love. Make it an absolute priority to lead. Make it an absolute priority for responsibility, for provision. Like the accountability aspect of it, of like having other men around us, like the way that we do that is 1,000% accountability. And that's extended through discipleship, whether it be peer-to-peer or, an older man. I think, I have those examples in my life, like with the men that I named. I'm even thinking of like Judah, Brandon, Stephen, Robert Rittenhouse. Like these are just men that, like, I 100% expect them, if they see me on some nonsense, to call me out for it. I fully expect them like to ask me like the tough questions, like, hey, like, what has your life looked like recently? Like, hey, what does loving your wife look like this past week? Or, hey, like, what does it look like to sacrificially love your wife? And for me, it's because I'm married, but, even when we were in the season of singleness, it's like, hey, like, what does it look like to submit to God this week? What does it look like to die to your desires? Like, those are the questions that we have had over the last 8+ years of friendship. So
I'm hearing a lot of, hey, we want to be intentional about identifying like the traits of biblical manhood in ourselves and how we can express them more. And I think I would take it another step further, is like being intentional about when we read scripture and we open up God's word, that we're also identifying biblical manhood when it comes up, right?
100%.
Not only when Jesus goes and dies on a cross, but also like when he is sitting and being patient with people, and he is loving the body of Christ and eating with people that frankly like are different from him, that he's taking that initiative and going out to minister to people and love on them and meet them where they're at. That is just as much as biblical manhood as him having a death that defeats sin and grave.
Yeah, or even like rebuking the Pharisees and saying, you brood of vipers, and saying that you're messing up. Obviously don't call everybody a brood of vipers, but to love and to be.
Those are fighting words.
Yeah, have that fearless rebuke when there's wrong being had in the body of Christ.
Yeah. Thank you guys both for sharing your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for listening to this podcast. We'll see you next time you awaken the day.
Cue the music.
Royalty free, of course.
Royalty free.
Always.
Boom.